Okay, welcome everyone. We'll get started just now. Thank you for joining this Innovation Forum webinar. I am Lia Dajao and I lead on the Sustainable Packaging series here at Innovation Forum. Today, I'm joined by Amanda Marti, who is McDonald's US Sustainability Manager and Circularity Lead. So welcome, Amanda. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll discuss the role of food retailers and quick service restaurants in enabling packaging sustainability at scale. We'll dive into how McDonald's is dealing with circularity, how regulation, infrastructure, and consumers impact packaging choices, and the challenges of scaling sustainable packaging solutions in an operational context of 14,000 restaurants in the US alone. So before I turn to Amanda to set the scene for this webinar, I want to hear from the audience. So in the second half of the webinar, we'll be looking at some audience questions. Please, throughout the conversation, think about what you would like me to ask to Amanda and just add it in the box here on the window that you can see. If you feel comfortable, you can add your name and organization and also upvote other people's questions. So please don't wait towards the end of the webinar to submit the questions, just submit them as we go and I'll keep an eye on the box below. All right, now that the housekeeping is done, Amanda, can you please introduce yourself and your role at McDonald's briefly?
Yeah, totally. Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Marti. I'm a manager on McDonald's US sustainability team, and I am our circularity lead. So I have our recycling goals. I support on our packaging goals as well, food donation, compost, you name it. And then I also dabble into the regenerative agriculture space too, because the aforementioned things weren't enough that I have to support our potatoes and oil folks too, just for kicks. So I'm really excited to be with you all today and to talk trash.
I love that topic as well. So let's get started. What does packaging sustainability look like for McDonald's in the US broadly?
Yeah, in the US, it really plays a big role in reducing food waste and helping us serve our hot and our freshly prepared food quickly and safely for our customers. And so in 2025, we have US goals that roll up to our global public facing commitments. And that's to make sure that our packaging is sourced from certified, recycled, or renewable materials. And so our ambition is that these packaging materials are part of a circular economy. Keyword ambition, we're not quite there yet, but we want to. And so there's a long pathway to get there. Some examples of our packaging items that fall within the renewable, certified, or recycled category. Our breakfast carryout bags, we've shifted them from plastic to paper, which is really exciting. We've eliminated a lid on our sundae cups. So those that are familiar with our McFlurries, you can see that we introduced a 4-flap system and even a cutie little mini McFlurry that I think is just adorable. We're redesigning our cups to reduce plastics, and then we're shifting from plastic to wooden stirrers. So a lot of work in the packaging space alone, and that's just not even in the recycling space. So really cool stuff.
Thank you so much for
Mhm.
this overview, Amanda.
Mhm.
I feel like when we think about packaging sustainability, there's a lot of debate around different solutions. And you've mentioned some of them, renewable, recycled. Some organizations out there might be wondering, should we focus more on recyclability? Should we focus more on reuse and refill, alternative or next generation materials? So I guess my question for you here is, how does McDonald's prioritize in this landscape?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that saying, what gets measured gets done, right? So we have to prioritize our goals. In the US, we have our 2025 packaging goals and then our 2025 recycling goals. And so both of those we need to make sure that we meet. And then second is to make sure that we're in compliance with current legislation and work toward upcoming legislation. And so it kind of goes goals, current legislation, upcoming legislation, and then you throw EPR and eco-modulation into the mix, and I know it does get a little hairy in there. So what we're ultimately trying to do is set us up for assured supply in the years to come, and what pathways get us there and doing the right thing for the earth at the same time. And we're still kind of learning from our European friends who are rolling out reuse, right now, and they're learning, and they're understanding the environmental, the economic, operational impacts that reuse has to their restaurants and to the consumers. And we're seeing, water and energy use and the impact of reuse return rates and what does that mean? And what I can say is we're concerned about the unintended consequences and perhaps negative environmental consequences, such as increased plastic use from just creating the reusables. Now, if we were to bring that to the US, remember we said 14,000 restaurants. That's a lot
Yeah.
of plastic to be used if we were to roll out a nationwide reuse scheme. And so you've got the increased plastic usage, the waste if the reusables aren't returned. And I think I've said this to you before, but imagine being in college and you see a really cool McDonald's branded fry container that's reusable. Well, somebody's going to want to have their ramen noodles in it in their dorm room. And so you have the loss that comes with that. And then the increased water and energy from having to wash them. So a lot to learn. And so based on that, we've had some challenges in retaining those. It's not unique to McDonald's, though. We know that, and we've talked to some of our friends. And so, back to your original question, prioritizing those goals, I think, is making the most sense to us right now.
Thank you so much for that overview. I feel like you really touched upon one of the challenges in sustainability sometimes when it comes to like actually implementing it, which is having to balance those environmental, economic, and operational constraints and kind of put them all on the table to think about which solutions make more sense in context. This actually makes me think about what we were saying about the 14,000 restaurants, right? Scaling packaging sustainability across this operational reality does not seem like an easy task. So reflecting on your own work on the ground, what are some steps to take for scale to be achieved, and what then makes it challenging in terms of packaging sustainability?
Mm-hmm. So 14,000 restaurants alone in the US. Of those, roughly 2,000 are under some sort of packaging related legislation. And so even 2,000 alone, there are some QSR chains that's a lot for them, right? And so you have to think about it in kind of phases. So oftentimes what we'll do when implementing any sort of sustainability or operational or whatever initiative it might be, we pilot first in the lens of sustainability and packaging sustainability and recycling specifically. We've done pilots in those areas where legislation exists. So that way, what we're testing is really tangible for the folks in those communities. And so, one of our 2025 goals for recycling this year is to implement in restaurant recycling solutions to our legislated restaurants, for some of our corporate owned restaurants, and then our flagship ones as well. And what that means is, you think about the map of the United States, it kind of falls predominantly into California. And so when we were redesigning this receptacle, we wanted to test in California where those consumers are already used to recycling in some capacity. And what are we introducing to them? And does it make sense? Is it intuitive? And how can we adapt? But also on the flip side, we want to test in a demographic in an area where perhaps it's legislated, but they're not as familiar. It's kind of new to them. Does this resonate as much to them there as it maybe would in California or in the EU, for example? Like our friends in the EU have been doing for many, many years. They have bins in place, but folks in the EU are so used to recycling that testing there and comparing what their experience and behavior is to what's in the US is not really an apples to apples comparison. So when we scale, we'll do those two different types of pilots. We'll learn from each of those and then we'll iterate and we'll slowly try to adapt. It's a little bit more pressing this year because our goal is to have those solutions in 2,000 restaurants before the end of the year. So we had to work expeditiously, but what's been really helpful is the cross-functional alignment here at McDonald's. There are multiple teams that are involved in this and who are held accountable for ultimately meeting this goal, which is really, really helpful.
Actually, on these, I have a question for you, because speaking of sustainability challenges, sometimes another one that often comes up is the difficulty of translating across teams that works in
Mm.
completely different segments of the business. So when different teams have different goals, what strategies have you found particularly effective in bringing everybody around a shared outcome?
Mhm. It goes back to that saying, the what gets measured gets done. You can't refute the fact that this is a goal for the organization, right? So that's really helpful to at least start the conversation with other folks within the organization. It's also really hard not to prioritize legislation. It's the law. You can't really say no to that. So getting them on the same page, that's helpful too, to kind of ground us all in making that decision. It's also really helpful getting other organizations on board. So when you comply with EPR or you deal with the financial and reputational repercussions, I think that that's really good for us as well. It's interesting when you think of the goals of, say, our development team, right? They have ambitions to build new restaurants, not only in the US, but globally. And to balance that with, let's go back to this recycling example of putting new bins in our restaurants. Our team has had to think a little bit quicker on creating this design because we know as new restaurants are built, this is now going to be a best practice and it's going to be a gold standard in any new restaurant. And so we've had that timeline that we've had to work together cross-functionally to meet. And I'm really proud of the team that worked on this because we came up with what I think is a best-in-class modular solution that can be deployed to all 14,000 restaurants, regardless if there's legislation in place or not, because it can be adaptable and modular. And so that means, in California, if those restaurants are required to compost and recycle their packaging items, well, then they have those streams, right? There's a green stream and there's a blue stream, and there can be a gray for landfill. But if you were to go to, say, North Dakota, where perhaps that's not legislated or they don't have access to do any of those, they can simply plop out the bezels and have 3 landfill streams and be totally fine. But it still complies with our global gold standard new bin that we've created. And in the event that that legislation changes in, say, the state of North Dakota, they can then easily modify that one unit versus having to buy another bin, that costs money.
Thank you. I feel like the
Mm.
connection that you just drew between global standards and then the localized approaches in the different restaurants, it's actually quite interesting. And I think that connects also to a question here that I see in the Q&A box, where Stefan was asking a bit more insights on the comparison between the operational reality in the US and
Mm.
the one in Europe. And what makes it particularly challenging, again, to implement reuse in store and in kitchen operations. Stefan
Yeah.
also mentions store design optimization. I don't know if you want to pick up on that because I personally don't know exactly what that is
No,
about.
I gotcha. I gotcha, Stefan. Great question. Let's start with the EU to US comparison. So we are in conversations with our global design team as well. And our global design team deployed the EU version of this recycling bin that we're talking about today. And theirs is robust, for lack of a better term. Folks in the EU are familiar with how to recycle. They've been doing this for, 10 plus years. And so it's already intuitive and built into the way that they dispose of their products, right? So there's a stream for, say, plastics versus fiber. There's a different stream for cups to be collected separately. In the US, we're just not there yet. They just aren't used to it. And so we've kind of had to start fresh, and that's what is the challenge here, is we're only as strong as what our consumers do in our restaurants and curbside. And so we've learned from our EU friends about what went well, what worked well for them, and what tools educationally and marketing wise and design wise worked, and then adapted it to kind of meet our consumers in the US where they are. So that's that portion of the question. We talked a little bit about reusables and the scale there. It's challenging. It's even challenging in the EU when we think about, as I mentioned before, the environmental impacts, but we're continuously learning from those trials and from those markets and our friends in the EU who are and have those in their systems today. We're noticing it's a lot of water, it's a lot of plastic. There's the emissions that go into making these products, not to mention the loss as well. And then you think about, Stefan, you mentioned the changing restaurant size, right? So restaurants are just getting smaller. Back of house, lobbies, they're getting smaller. We have less space to put things physically. And so, operationally, for our owner operators and our franchisees to have to purchase a dishwasher, for example, or a collection bin in front of house for those reusables, it's hard. Where do you put that in the restaurant? And so, you have to get really, really creative in operations, and even logistically, do we leverage other third parties to support us in this? And so, it's an ongoing conversation that we're having. In the US, we are very pro recycling, and less so in the reuse space because of those challenges we're seeing in the EU.
Thank you so much for addressing Stefan's question as well. And
Yeah,
we see more questions popping up. Please keep them going, and we're going to integrate them in the conversation as we go.
good.
So three things stood out from what we were just talking about. One aspect is the consumer's engagement side, so
Mm,
both the educational and marketing.
mhm,
And the second one is then regulation. So do we want to start with regulations or consumer sentiment? What do you think?
Let's do consumers.
Let's
Yeah.
go with consumers then. What can you tell me about what it's like to engage consumers in packaging sustainability, what you have seen
Mhm.
working and what you have seen not working as well?
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer from a US perspective right now because we're really in the process of rolling it out as we speak. And so talk to me in, 6 months and I might have a better answer for you based on some learnings that we have. But I will say it's been critical to think of guest packaging from the lens of the consumer. Every decision that we make at McDonald's is thinking about our owner operators, our franchisees, and ultimately our consumer and what their sentiment and experience is. And so when we put on our consumer hat, we know our success is only as strong as what they do in our restaurants, especially because we are not having our crew members sort out inaccurately sorted items in the front of house bins for safety purposes. I don't want our crew members, diving in and resorting things in the event that there's something not safe in those bins. And so knowing that, we need to be really, really intentional in how we label our bins. So we've put words, we've put icons, we've put instructions on the bins themselves to take a lot of the thinking out of it. Um, we have plans to perform behavioral analyses to kind of see how they interpret those icons, right? How do they sort those icons? Are they resonating well with them? Are they clear and concise? And then we'll iterate over time based on their feedback, and we'll deploy new marketing and new educational materials if we have to. We've also partnered with our US marketing team on putting signage around the restaurants themselves, just to kind of double down and reiterate, hey, we're now recycling in this restaurant, and here's what you can do. Please make sure you remember to sort your items at the bin. What so this solves a problem that's in the four walls of our restaurants. So if you think a bit about it, McDonald's is really big on delivery, digital, drive-through. That consumption of products within the four walls of our restaurants is somewhere in the 10 to 20%, depending on the time of year and in the restaurant itself. So 10 to 20%, let's call it 16 for the sake of today, of our guest-facing packaging is consumed within the four walls of our restaurants. Then Leah, you and I, we're going to sit down. I'm going to have my high C orange because I love it. And you're going to have a coffee. I chug my high C orange. You slowly sip your coffee. When it's time for us to finish our meal, we go to the bin. I can recycle all of my things because I'm done with my high C, but you're going to take your coffee out with you. You're going to keep that going. So we can kind of estimate maybe 50% of that 16% is actually disposed of in the restaurants, right? Because you brought your product to
Yeah.
go. Then we can estimate roughly 2 to 3%, maybe even more if it's a new legislative market, will inaccurately sort their products in the restaurants. And so now we're at 5 to 6% of in-restaurant guest-facing packaging is accurately disposed of in the appropriate streams in our bins. That's not a lot of our product, right? And so we've really stretched ourselves to think about what can we do beyond the four walls of our restaurants and how can we engage our consumers at home in the curbside. And that's where education comes into play, not just in our marketing materials in our bins in our restaurants, but it's critical to partner with those in the industry on getting the messaging out on how to dispose of products. And I think that's where, how to recycle can come into play. The recycling partnership has Birdie, which is adorable, to kind of type in your zip code and understand how things can be disposed of properly. But it's going to be a challenge for sure.
And I think these insights that we were just reflecting upon connect quite well to the last question that was just submitted in the Q&A by an anonymous attendee, who were asking about plans for recycling in the United States. You already touched upon the fact that there are these standards that are put in the restaurants where there is the regulation in place and I guess the infrastructure in place. Could you expand a bit more on infrastructure there and what cross-industry collaborations is doing in that space? So you can pick up on some of these partnerships mentioned or think about other examples.
Yeah. So our cross-industry partners play a critical role in achieving these goals for McDonald's and getting us as an industry where we need to be. And so McDonald's engages frequently, weekly, multiple times a week with the recycling partnerships, Polypropylene Recycling Coalition. We're founding members of the Next Gen Consortium. We're actively engaged in the Food Service Packaging Institute, and so many other industry partners are helping us along this journey. And without those organizations doing what they do behind the scenes, talking to legislative makers and policy makers and lobbying behind the scenes and making sure that the education is there, the grants that we're funding through those organizations to increase the infrastructure and the capabilities of the material recovery facilities, it's critical. I mean, it's integral into increasing the access and infrastructure that we need, specifically for our polypropylene cup and then for our fiber-based products as well. And I can't stress the importance of gaining alignment with the industry through those partners so that we're all working together toward a common goal. That's really, really critical for McDonald's and I would say for our other, friends on the founding memberships of Next Gen and PPRC.
Thank you. Thank you for this overview also of some of the key industry actors that are working together in the space. I'm seeing right now a lot of questions on the back of this focus on recycling, asking about different types of materials. So we have some questions on whether there is the intention to use more environmentally friendly materials, such as plant-based options, but also whether we see a role being played by certification labels to communicate the sustainability story of the source. Do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, so the bio-based question brings us back to our 2025 packaging goals that renewable, certified, or recycled materials. Bio-based are certainly being tested. Some are received well by consumers and others are not. And so, like I said before, we make every decision with our owner operator and our consumers in mind. And if our consumers don't like the experience that they have, if it's not at parity or better than the previous one, then we need to go back to the drawing board and figure it out. And that's where we're at with certain products. We are thinking about, right sizing our products and our packaging, making decisions on eco-modulation as it relates to EPR. Those are critical in what we're doing in the future too. And then designing for recyclability is critical because if you think about certain things like dip cups, they're small and they can't necessarily be sorted in every material recovery facility because they're less than the 2x2x2, right? So how can we design those, for example? We're thinking about not just our guest facing packaging now. It's beyond that, and it's starting to think about back of house and other materials that we're using. I forgot the back half, the second part of that question, Leah. What
The
was it?
second part was about certifications.
Sort of.
So, yeah, whether you see a role for these certifications in communicating the sustainability value of the packaging choices you're making.
So I can't speak much to the certification portion of things. I will say that we are actively engaged with FSC, and those are on our fiber-based products. And then at some point in time, we'll consider leveraging how to recycle once we get above the access thresholds in the US. And from a polypropylene standpoint, I don't believe I know of any plans at that point.
Could you just briefly expand on what this access threshold in the US
Mm.
is, just for our global audience as well?
Yes, great question. So, in the US, for a material to be considered widely accessible or widely recyclable, excuse me, it needs to exceed a 60% threshold rate. And so, polypropylene is around 58 right now. If that number can be advanced or increased through um, infrastructure investments and grants in our communities where recovery facilities are introducing optical sorters or whatever it may be, or new material for recovery facilities are brought online, then that number can increase, meaning more folks at home can recycle our clear McDonald cold cup with confidence. And then once it gets above that threshold, you can change that label that says instead of check locally, it says widely recyclable under it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience that keeps submitting these questions. We're going to put the audience questions on pause for 1 second and just touch upon the regulations point, because
Yep.
I think right now we have seen it also from the previous webinar and in general from the conversations of the industry. EPR is taking the center stage. So I just wanted to hear your take on how McDonald's is navigating these.
Yeah. EPR has been quite a doozy, huh? I'd say it's been really interesting for folks. And it's really gotten a lot of our teams together. And so cross-functionally, you've got our government relations team, both federal, state, and local. Um, Federal is one team, state and local is the other one. That's why I say both. Our public policy team, sourcing, sustainability, finance, you name it, a team is involved in this process. And to think about it, not just by wanting this reporting and compliance, what that means to the company, but also what it means to our consumers. Once again, every decision is made for our consumers in mind. And what does it mean for them in those states like Oregon and other states who have EPR coming online? And how do we make sure financially, it's not a burden onto them? And so our sourcing team, who has taken the lead on this, they've been so great at getting on top of this. And based on conversations that we've had with other folks in the industry, some of whom may be on the line, hello, we're pretty far ahead of the curve here. And I like to think of ourselves as kind of leading the space in this. We've also recently joined CAA, so the Circular Action Alliance, as a founding member. And we're proud to be one of the only QSRs to join as a founding member. And so I think that there are maybe two other founding members who are also QSRs. And so being a loud voice in that room and advocating for others in the QSR industry is going to be really, really important here to make sure that they understand what we've talked about today, Leah, right? Like the operational difficulties, the impact to each of the consumers, and the fragmented nature that EPR is right now and the difficulties that we're facing with that.
Thank you so much for also pointing out how these operational realities, yes, they kind of help deciding which packaging strategies to adopt, but they also pose a challenge when it comes to coordinating different actors. On the regulation piece, I think there's quite an interesting question that allows us to talk a bit about circularity
Okay.
as well. So John is asking, how much do you think the goals on circular economy, for example, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's work, have are helped or hindered by some of the emerging legislation?
That's a great question. I think what's important is with the upcoming legislation, we think about it in the lens of not only compliance, but the benefits that we can have to our guests. So we're thinking a lot about eco-modulation as well. And in the spirit of EPR, certain materials are less of a fee or a tax than others. And so how can we as McDonald's adapt to adjust to those perhaps to put less of a burden onto our consumers? We also need to make sure that we're not only designing for recyclability, we're designing for that circular economy that John mentioned. And so that's our ultimate ambition, like what I mentioned at the start. And so how can we collect our cup, for example, in some of our restaurants, keep that stream separate, which reminder, our bins don't do that right now. It's a single recycling stream. But how could we capture certain types of materials and turn that back into something else of that same material for McDonald's? And if it's a cup to a cup, it's a fiber product to a different fiber product. How can we keep that infrastructure and the tracking in place while also maintaining food grade safe raw materials? And that's a big complex challenge to overcome as well. I don't know if that answered John's question, but that's kind of where we're at.
Well, John, let us know if you have any follow-up questions in the box. I would like to ask another question from the audience now that connects again with your broader expertise that you introduced at the beginning. So you mentioned that you also work across Regen Ag. So
Mm.
here there is a question from Alistair. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, who is asking, when assessing more sustainable packaging solutions,
Mhm.
are life cycle assessment used as a tool to investigate the environmental footprint of alternative packaging, so for example, paper-based packaging, and to identify hotspot areas for mitigation, for example, land use change? Um, do you have something to add here on how you use LCAs,
Yeah.
not just for the packaging solutions, but also for those solutions that can bring in other types of mitigation strategies?
It's all connected, right? Which, you see my remit at first and you're like, huh, that doesn't make sense. But it does. It does. They do connect, like Alistair mentioned. So first, to address the LCA, yes, we are leveraging life cycle analyses in making our decisions. Back of house, we're already starting to think about material changes to more recyclable materials, to divert materials like poly bags from the landfill by introducing perhaps fiber-based products. And what does that mean? Fiber is a little heavier than a poly bag, but it's being recycled. And so there are a lot of these things to weigh out, especially when it comes to EPR as well and the financial component. When it comes to things like land use change, I don't think we're quite there yet on making that connection. I would love to hear more about it, but I will say we're considering, carbon emissions in our decision making as well, water use and how it can ultimately impact those goals that we have that are also public facing commitments.
Thank you. Last
Mm.
one on materials, actually, as we're on the topic of LCA and decisions. What about seaweed packaging?
Mhm.
Is that something that you're exploring? And actually, someone in the audience is saying, yeah, it would be interesting to talk to you about seaweed packaging, which is home compostable and curbside disposable. Have you considered that?
Ooh.
Why? Why not?
We have not yet, but it's been on my radar. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. There have been other conversations and solutions that have been brought forward to us about leveraging, fishing nets in our lobby trays and things like that. I'm a marketer's dream. You bring something to my attention and I'm like, yes, let's go do it. But I have to ground myself and remind myself that we can't do everything at once. We need to be really, really targeted in what we do and prioritize accordingly. And so what I will say is this, bring your ideas forward. I love them. I love to hear them. I think that they're great. Will we be able to prioritize them right away? Possibly not. But I think it's important to bring them to large organizations like McDonald's so that way we can leverage our scale because even the smallest of changes with our scale can have a major, major impact. Do I see ourselves going into seaweed packaging, tomorrow? Probably not. Consumer perception will be really, really critical in making a decision like that. But I think it's a great idea that we could consider for, you know, back of house things. So I love it. But we also have to be a little realistic too.
Well, thank you, Amanda. And I think that we're Well, we have still 5 more minutes before the end of this webinar. Um, I just wanted to share actually, there's a very nice comment here in the chat from a customer who didn't know about all the efforts that McDonald's was implementing in the space in
Hmm.
the US. And they're asking, in light of these, are you planning to be more vocal about these significant initiatives? For
Hmm.
example, could you communicate these efforts in restaurants and also educate consumers about the importance of their decision making and the impact of packaging disposal?
I think that's great. And that's a perfect example of something that we can learn from our customers that are coming into the 2000 restaurants that will have the new bins in scope of 2025. Because it's not a nationwide launch, right? 2000 out of the 14,000. It's hard to go on air and have a commercial that's broadcasting what we're doing, because you also have this brand perception that it brings light to the other restaurants that might not be doing that, without the consumers having the knowledge that perhaps it's not, they don't have access to in that area, but they just don't have that knowledge. And so we try to balance that in what we communicate out to the world. What we will do is, in the restaurants that are recycling, make sure that that messaging is really clear. And then we're continuing to figure out ways to tell the story beyond the four walls of the restaurant, leveraging technology or whatever that may be. Thank you so
Thank
much for being excited about it. I hope that you're close to one of the in-scope restaurants so you can recycle.
Well, thank you everybody who engaged, and of course, thank you, Amanda. As we're approaching the end, if you could leave the audience with one insight on what it takes to scale packaging sustainability, what would
Mhm.
that be?
There are so many, but I think our hardest challenge is consumer education, both in the restaurant and curbside. So operationally, we don't have our crew members sort inaccurately sorted packaging, like I mentioned before, for safety reasons. And so we truly are only as strong as what our consumers put in those bins. So it's critical they know how to recycle properly. And while we'll do what we can to educate in the restaurants, it's so important to emphasize and reiterate that messaging at home and in the communities. And so we're leveraging those third-party friends of ours at the Recycling Partnership, the Polypropylene Recycling Coalition, the Next Gen Consortium, to help us with the consumer education. But it takes everybody, and every little bit counts. So that, I think, would be our key insight: is consumers, consumers, consumers. Every decision we make is for you.
So, yes, today we talked about consumers, we talked about in-store solutions, infrastructure solution, how iteration and adaptation can help scale, and the operational realities versus sustainability ambition. These are all themes that we're actually going to keep discussing at the Sustainable Packaging Innovation Forum 2025 in Chicago. Amanda and I will be there, and I hope we'll get to connect with some of the experts in the audience as well. I know we couldn't go through all the questions, so one more reason to join us. I see some people are based in Chicago. By any
Yeah.
means, my colleagues just popped the link with more information in the chat. And we have a discount up until tomorrow, so it's a great time to sign up if you're thinking to do so. If you have some time, a survey will pop up at the end of this webinar. You can let us know what you thought about this conversation, or if you have any ideas of what we should cover next in packaging sustainability.
Mm.
Thanks again to Amanda for joining us and sharing her expertise. And yeah, thank you also to our audience for all the great questions. Have a good day ahead and goodbye.
Thank you so much, everybody.